Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The God of your moment is with you in this moment. See, your moment will never come at the perfect time or under the perfect circumstances, but you have a perfect time. So what if we thought about our what ifs a little differently? What if our what ifs could be all about our faith? What if instead of our what ifs being about our concerns, what if they could be about our confidence? What if instead of those being our doubt, what if we could make those what ifs our trust? What if we flip the script on this thing a little bit? That every time I say, what if I mess up, instead I said, what if God shows up? What if instead of saying, what if I don't have what it takes? What if I say, what if God's using this as a setup in the midst of this setback? When I say, what if it's too late? What if instead I say, what if God's doing this just in time? In those moments when I say, what if I'm scared? Instead, what if I said, what if God is doing something wonderful in the midst of this? And I know I can trust him to nurture me and protect me right in the middle of the place where I am. What if we changed our language about the what ifs? What if instead of it being filling us with fear, we allowed it to fill us with trust? What if we asked God to do something big in our life? What if we would shift this in this moment, in this window of time, and allow our what ifs to be something that causes us to trust him more than ever? Well, thanks for taking a few moments to watch this really special conversation. If you've been kind of keeping track on our Facebook page over the last couple of months, I've been having some conversations with my friends. We've been calling it introductions, and these are my opportunities to be able to introduce my friends to my friends. And so we've been doing these, and I wanted to do something really special tonight for this kind of Friday night, kind of unique part of one of these introductions, because of some things that we have been seeing in the headlines for years, but predominantly over the last few weeks that really impacted me. And so I want to introduce you to a couple of my friends. This is Steffon and Sharon Thomas, and they're not just my friends. I'm going to guess for a lot of people, they're your friends too at Calvary. And so guys, thanks for taking a few minutes to catch up and chat for a few. So thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Here's just a quick introduction. We were just talking a minute ago. We've known each other for 15 years.
Yeah.
When you guys came to your Toledo life 1.0, this is Toledo 2.0, I know for you guys, but that seems like a long time ago. I think you guys have not changed, and I have become a much bigger man.
No, you haven't changed a bit.
Just real quick, give us just a little bit background on you, your family, and what you do.
Sure.
So, yeah, we are Steffon and Sharon. Hi, everyone. We came to Calvary in 2005 when we moved here from Cleveland. We went to college in the Cleveland area. And then before that, we both grew up on the East Coast. So when we moved to Toledo in 2005, we began taking one of our children to the daycare that used to be at Calvary. And through the daycare, we began going to church. Began going to church at Calvary, and then we were there. I took a staff position for a while. I was the early childhood director. I worked under Pastor Keith, and it was one of my, favorite things ever. It was a great experience, great job. I'm just saying that because we're talking to you right now.
It's working. You're good.
Then we moved to California for a couple of years, and then we moved back. And we've been back since 2016. And, we continue to go to church. I'm a writer, creative consultant. I have done many writing jobs, and I'm a freelance writer, and I do a bunch of creativity.
And I am a pediatric ICU doctor. So we actually moved to Toledo when I started medical school in 2005. And we had our first child, who was only an infant at that point. Now we have 3 kids. They're all old and self-sufficient now, or so they think. So we've got a high school kid, a middle school kid, and I guess our elementary school kid just graduated from elementary school yesterday.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
he was just born yesterday.
I think so too. Right.
Right.
Man, oh man. Well, and it's been fun to watch your family kind of move along. Like as you've been talking, I'm thinking, Steffon, your business card should read creative genius. I don't know how many had, conversations. I'm being like, I wonder, have you ever done this? And just about everything I've ever asked you, you've either, yes, I've done it, or I haven't done that, but I've done this that tops that. And so,
and then a lot of my creativity when I was on staff at Calvary, you guys allowed me to do some really fun creative stuff with like Christmas extravaganza and children's ministry. So yeah.
You talked me into many things I've regretted, but hey,
hashtag Gilligan 6.
Yeah. So changing the subject quickly, the nature, kind of the challenge for me was earlier this week, and I'm going to guess most everybody that's watching this, earlier this week, the headlines came of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department. And we've seen this video, and even as we are in the midst of this, the protests that are happening, and everything that's there. And I'm watching this video, and I don't think anybody could watch it and not be appalled at what you see that happens there. And then in the process of that, I'm scrolling through social media, Instagram, Facebook, and I see all these posts, which are good things. They're great things where people are posting their outrage and they're posting their thoughts. And so many people saying this has to stop. And the thing that just hit me though was, okay, I agree in every way, appalling, and it has to stop. But what do I do? Like what's my role? What's my part in how does this stop? And I'll give a little bit of background, and then I'll kind of, throw this your way. Sure. I grew up in rural Northeast Ohio. My small public high school, we were joking a few minutes ago, I think there were, like 2 or 3 kids that we would call minorities in this school. My experience is largely a white middle-class experience. That's what I know. One of the gifts in my life has been to be able to have friends that I can have a communication and a conversation with in seasons like this that help me to see that there's a whole world that's bigger than what's going on in my brain. And so you guys have been a gift in my life to help me to grow as a person, to see, man, there is a bigger world that is there. And so when I was looking at these headlines and Instagram posts and thinking, man, what do I do as a part of this? The thought that came to me was, I would love to have a conversation about this. So thanks for being willing to have this conversation. We're going to talk about racism for the next few moments, which for some people may be an uncomfortable conversation, but I think it's a necessary conversation. We're going to talk about the fact that there are differences among us that it's okay to recognize, but then also say, we've got to come to terms with what does it mean to live as Christians in particular in seasons like this. So I guess my intro question to you would be, I see the news about George Floyd's death, and I say it's appalling and it impacts me. And I'm going to guess you guys have an impact that is very similar, and yet in many ways, I'm going to guess very different. Can we talk a little bit about when whether it was the story of Ahmaud Arbery a few weeks ago or George Floyd, what's the impact of that?
Yeah, so I think there are several things. I think the first thing that it's important to recognize is that this has been said in multiple ways, but this situation is not new. It's just being filmed. The Black community is very well aware of this. This has been happening for decades. And it's something that we're acutely aware of, that has been a source of, sorrow and frustration. The difference now is that it's in the public eye and anybody can make it widely available. Mm-hmm. So there's a certain piece of this that, is like, well, yeah, this happened. It's been happening. There's another piece of this that's really kind of triggering, because it's like, we're watching, these killings of Black people over and over again in the media. And it's reminiscent of, lynchings almost that have been publicized. And you see this over and over and over and over again. And then the third thing is that, we're watching people who are being killed and they look like us. And they're doing innocuous things a lot of the time. And that is really terrifying in a lot of ways, as well as being heartbreaking and as well as being infuriating. But I think that those are kind of the three.
And I think
that I would say.
I think another thing is that we're seeing it in video and we're seeing it on we're seeing these things happen, and it's kind of like this frustration where it's like, hey, we've been telling you that these things have happened, and people, there's this degree of like, it's not that bad out there. It's not that bad, like, and everything. And now, we're seeing things on video, and that's what's causing a lot of people to say like, oh, actually it is that bad. And we're like, well, we were telling you that. We weren't saying it for our health. We don't want it to be this bad. We weren't making it up. But like, so I think that's another thing when we see this, and we like, one of my first reactions was kind of like, guys, see, like, it's happening. See, we weren't, we don't want to be validated in that way, but it's kind of, it's difficult to swallow when it feels like you've been saying it, and sometimes certain segments of society don't believe you.
We were talking before we started the recording about how oftentimes if you're having a conversation with someone of a different race, there's like a process that conversation about racism has to kind of work through. And it's funny, when you were describing it, I was like, I can relate to having had that conversation, because your world kind of your worldview has to change as you're I think as you mature and grow as a person, and especially even in your faith. Can you talk a little bit about that conversational process as you're connected with somebody?
Sure. So I think I'll start. So one of the things that we often find is that it's a very difficult subject to bring up, because nobody wants to be racist, right? But the problem is that we live in a society that has systems that are built on racism. One of the things that we've learned over the years is that when the founding fathers were writing the Constitution, they knew that there was an inherent conflict between saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, except for those slaves we have. And they wrestled with it in the first few drafts, and then they just left it out. So, when you start with that kind of foundation, and then you have all these, these policies and systems that are built with that as the foundation, we have now a system that's really literally woven into the tapestry and fabric of our nation. And that's the reality. So the expression of that is what we all experience, but some of us don't benefit from it. And some people do benefit from it. And so I think that makes it—
bringing up the conversation.
So when we bring up the conversation, it's really hard for people who benefit from it to appreciate that they're benefiting and others are not, because I think it makes them sad. I think that's horrible. I think most people want everybody to really be treated equal, but the reality is that that's not what happens. And so I was, explaining earlier that we find that there are several stages. What we've experienced in the past is that sometimes we'll bring it up, and then sometimes it's shut down and people will say, well, you're playing the race card. It isn't always about race. So that puts a stop to the conversation. Okay. Other times we get to the point where people immediately respond, well, I'm not racist. And I'm like, that's great. However, we experience racism both on a macro and a micro level. Usually, people kind of progress to saying, okay, well, what about, personal responsibility? Which is great, except when we're talking about systems, there is a certain degree of a lack of control over the way that the systems impact people differently. And then, we kind of get to the point where people say, okay, so, I don't want this to be the case for you or for anybody, so what do I do? And then I think that's where we can really start to dig in, because what's important is that there has to be a level of humility to just hear and understand and accept and believe that when we say these things happen to us, and this is the egregious stuff, right? Like, we're talking about the stuff that's obvious racism. We're not talking about the microaggressions and the more subtle expressions of racism that we experience on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you said quite a bit, but and we usually one of the things that we were talking about before we started filming was the idea that coded language is very important to this. And what I mean by coded language is, for example, instead of saying, oh, no one wants to hear someone say, oh, Black people are poor or live in bad neighborhoods. Instead, they'll say something like, oh, the inner city has problems. And, there's a lot of, so when we hear things, a lot of people will hear it's like, oh, well, someone's just reporting the facts, or someone's just stating some facts. And we are hearing that's like coded racism, and they don't necessarily know that they're saying what they're saying is coded racism. But that's when we talk about, when someone says, well, what can we do? We say, well, you got to begin to kind of examine, if what you're saying or what you're participating in does have some kind of undertones that you may not be aware of. So,
and I think a lot of what we've talked about in these last few moments is hard for some people to hear, especially if it's not been my experience, right. And that's something I know that the three of us have talked about, in the past before. And Steffon, you mentioned something to me the other day about this whole concept of blind spots, which I think goes beyond even just the race part of our lives. But talk about that a little bit. I think the idea that there are things that are going on around me that I don't see or know, that concept of blind spots, that's a major part of us doing life together, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just, think of it, the first thing that comes to your mind of when you talk about blind spots is driving. We understand that we need to be looking in all of our mirrors as we're driving, and that we literally have blind spots. We don't know that there's something coming up on us. We don't know that there's something in certain proximity to us. And if we don't see it and then we veer into the next lane, we could crash, And as human beings, we have blind spots. It's impossible for us to have every experience possible, right? It's just impossible. Like, we can't, as you said, you grew up in, Northeast rural Ohio. I grew up in the North Bronx, and while, yes, New York City is, more diverse, there's, my neighborhood was pretty monolithic, And so I also had to learn the experiences of other people, and when we don't have blind spots, that prompts us, but it prompts us to do things that we just don't realize could cause danger to other people. If we don't see that car in our blind spot and we veer into them, it's going to run them off the road. They could crash, and that's what's happening, that we feel like we see that a lot in American culture with racism, is that there's a lot of good-hearted people who just don't know that some of the things that they're doing are saying is affecting people in their blind spot, and that they're running people off the road and they don't even know it, because they could keep driving and never knew they ran the person off the road, who was in their blind spot. I like to use metaphors. You're a great storyteller, so I also like to, do stories, But I mean, imagine if you have two groups of people. One people live at the top of a mountain and some people live at the bottom of the mountain. They don't have any malice toward each other or anything like that, but there is a river that flows down that mountain, right? The people at the top of the mountain say, hey, if we could build a dam, this would make our society so much better. We could grow more crops. We could feed our people. So they begin to build the dam. But that means the people at the bottom of the mountain are no longer getting water, right? So now their crops are dying and they're beginning to struggle and they're going hungry. One day, one of them realizes, hey, there's a dam up there. If we go and break that down, we can, we can have water again. The people at the top of the mountain don't realize what they've done. But if someone comes to break down their dam, they're going to fight it, right? And where instead, maybe it should be like, hey guys, you built a dam, now we're getting the water. The people up there should be like, oh, our bad, here, let's make it happen. But instead what we're getting is, well, hey, we got a dam, you guys don't, like, deal with it, oh well, and it wasn't any malice to begin with. But then when somebody comes and seems like they're going to take something away from you that you worked hard to build and you worked hard to cultivate, now it's a threat. When the people downriver, they just want some water too. They just want some water too, And I think that's kind of like, what we're talking about in these blind spots. It's like, yeah, you're building things that make things better for you, but how is that affecting other people,
And that's in every area of our lives, isn't it? I mean, that blind spot. So let's come back to this, because as I'm hearing you talk about that, I'm going at some point, like and rightfully so, like with the different things that we've seen in the headlines in the last few weeks, where there have been these tragic deaths that have happened. You could say, well, I can point to this big thing, or I can point to that big, struggle in society, when at the end of the day, at some point, it comes down to the state of our human hearts. So like when I watch and see, this has to stop, my response is, what do I do? And Sharon, I know when we talked about that progression of conversations, the hope is that at the end of that conversation, or maybe it's actually the beginning of the conversation, it gets to, okay, then what's my role to look past my blind spot and be the friend, the neighbor, the brother or sister in Christ that God would have for me to be. I know we talked a little bit about where that starts and what that looks like and what each one of us can do to grow together in these relationships. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think I mentioned earlier that listening with humility is probably the first thing. When Black people tell you that their experience is different, just listen.
Yeah, it's not an excuse.
It's
not like,
right.
Oh, it's not like this is why I'm in this situation, because
it's our reality.
Mm-hmm.
Just listen and be humble enough to accept that even though it says on paper that we're all equal, the reality is that it doesn't reach people for many, many systemic reasons. And so I think the listening is important. It's really hard to talk to people about these things and then not be believed. And so, again, some of these things are really obvious that we're seeing in the headlines. But that's the stuff that's easy to see. There are so many more subtle things that cause serious problems in, the daily lives of Black people in this country. So listening with humility. And then also, I would say that I think asking what to do is a good thing, but I think, you have to do some work on yourself, be introspective. Let's be honest, we all grew up in the United States. So there are certain perceptions and images, as it pertains to talking about the way that Black people are perceived in this country. We have to be honest about that, because we can't get past it if we're pretending that doesn't exist. And so I think being honest about that, there are, implicit biases and all these different things that play into how we interact with people and how we ultimately make decisions at the end of the day. So that's important to recognize. And then third of all, I would say, do the work, do some research, do some reading, understand some of the history about why this is the way it is and how this happens. And I think that helps to build a framework for empathy. And I think, just because you haven't lived somebody's experience doesn't mean that you can't empathize with them so that what their struggle is feels like something that could affect you. We were talking earlier about the fact that when we're sitting here watching these things, we're seeing somebody who looks like us. Never mind the other experiences that we've had personally, our close friends have had, and this is regardless of education level, socioeconomic status. That doesn't matter at the end of the day, which is what's so frustrating and so scary. For us, we worry about our kids walking around the neighborhood. If somebody decides they don't recognize them one day, what could happen? And that's our reality. we don't have the luxury of not talking about race because our survival depends on it. And I think, the fact that people who are not Black get to be uncomfortable talking about race says a lot. We don't get to be uncomfortable. We're uncomfortable because racism permeates every aspect of our lives in a lot of ways. So we don't get to be uncomfortable. We have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And so I think just having that realization is a really good place to start.
And I think it was interesting because we talked about this. This was a couple of years ago, but you had brought up the idea, you had said to us, we were just having a casual conversation, kind of talking about some of this stuff. And you said that you were on vacation with your family, and I want to say it was somewhere down south, maybe Florida or something, and you guys had to stop and go into a Walmart, or I think it was a Walmart.
Yeah.
And you immediately recognized that you were the only white people in there, And I think that one of the things is that, while that was, you noticed the experience, you could feel the experience, and just knowing that even if no one was being deliberately racist to you, you still had it still felt something. And that's an experience that we have gone into the higher in status or education or, places that we get into, the less and less people of color you see, I mean, I was the only Black person on staff at Calvary, for several years. And everything. And no, of course, everyone there treated me with respect. It was, everything like that. But I still had to be cognizant of that idea. And I still had to kind of, represent Blackness to everyone there in the workplace, and that was just an extra layer of things that I had to think about when I was there. And then the other thing that I did want to add to what Sharon was saying was just about understanding that there's not going to be any bit of logic that tells us this is why you shouldn't, this is why racism is bad, right? Hate is not logical,
Right.
No, like people try to make up logical reasons. Well, I hate these people because they're, violent or whatever. I don't know what it is. People make up reasons, right? But there's no logical reason for hate. And the way I would also parallel that is that there's no logical reason for love, right? Like the people we choose to love, like we can make up reasons. I can make up all the reasons in the world why I love this woman and why I married this beautiful, amazing, smart, intelligent woman, right? But what makes me love her any more than any other, beautiful, amazing, intelligent, logical woman? She's not the only one in the world, but I chose to love her, So when we start talking about what people can do, they can choose not to hate. They can choose the opposite of racism. And that does take work, just like having a loving marriage or a loving relationship with anyone you have. It takes work. It also takes work to not, so you're not going to get a logical reason why racism shouldn't exist because there's no logical reason it should,
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important, is that it takes work.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one thing we've talked about too is the fact that that people's silence says almost as much as what they do say. And so, when you're talking about, when people are saying, well, what can I do? Well, there's a lot you can do. The people who are not in the position to have a voice and to speak cannot change the system that is oppressing them. That has to come externally because they don't have the ability in that situation to do anything about it. And so I think, that's a really key element of it is, if you hear somebody making an inappropriate joke, call them out. It starts with those things. One thing I found interesting is that people are saying, well, how could those other officers just sit there? And how could they stand by? I would never do such a thing. And I thought, well, if you cannot call somebody out for using the N-word or for, assuming that somebody minding their own business has malintent or, the list could go on and on. If you can't do that, then you can kind of take it to the logical extreme of that, right? And I think, we all have a responsibility to call out injustice when we see it occur. But again, racism is interesting because it can be so subtle that unless you know that that's what's happening, I think oftentimes people who are not experiencing it don't even recognize that it's occurring.
Mm-hmm. And I think, and I need to qualify this, and this is something again that this you're actually going to see kind of like the way kind of Black people and African Americans kind of work in real time here, right? I have to qualify the idea that I don't want this discussion to feel like we're bashing all cops. We're not attacking all police officers or all white people or anything like that, or attacking anyone at all. You know, when we say these things, this is not that. You know, so you have to qualify that. You're seeing it in real time, and you know, but at the same time, there's this idea. There's a biblical principle that a tree is known by its fruit, right? And if we're saying that, you know, if we're talking about the police officers who are involved in this specific case, and we're like, well, hey, that's a bad apple. It's like, oh, that's a piece of fruit. So we have to figure out how do we prove, like in every profession, if you're saying like there are people who are doing this inappropriate things, you want to, you know, either discipline them or figure out a way to you know, get them out of that profession, because you don't want your profession to be seen as this negative thing. And I think that's where some of the harder part comes. And we start talking a little bit more about the macro. We're trying to not get too macro because we don't want to overwhelm.
We can get really kind of academic about this too.
You know, but
there's more here than just, and this is where, you know, even this conversation helps me as we're sitting here. There's more here than just prejudice, right? Like we can just go, well, there's just, you know, just some people are just prejudiced towards. And yet there's a bigger picture here of, and I appreciate words you use, like me coming to a place of humility and being willing to have empathy, you know, towards someone whose life experience is different than mine, you know? So, and I'll even say this, my conversations with the two of you have helped me to go, wow, the Black experience is very different from my white experience in everything from, driving a car and being pulled over, or being in a store and getting a look from someone, or you know, these different places. And I appreciate what you said about the qualifications, ST, but the reality is, like, there are these unique, you know, dynamics that we have to consider. You've helped me to think that through. And then the courage to say, okay, I can do something about this, even if it's just in my own heart first. And then, you know what, that joke's not funny anymore. And you know what, that person deserves my respect and my love and my, you know, and in those things. And that idea of blind spots and empathy goes beyond, because I've had to have those same conversations with people whose, not just their color's different than mine, but their health experience is different than mine. Or I would say, even in this season of the pandemic that we've been in, people are divided so much based on their own experiences that you have to put yourself in somebody else's spot and say, look, the healthcare professional has a different perspective than this person does, or the person whose loved one has these health issues is going to view it differently.
Or the person who's trying to run a business is going to, you know.
Huge, right? You know, and so part of this for me, and I know this is kind of off topic, but maybe the same, we were talking about this. One of the healthiest things that happened in my head one time was, you know, you watch the news, and every hurricane season there's hurricanes, and there's one that hits somewhere in Texas, and there's one that hits somewhere in Florida, and, you know, it's coming up the Atlantic coast and all this. And then when Hurricane Sandy hit Long Island, and I knew that I had stood on that beach, and that my friend actually lived 3 blocks inland from the very spot where I watched the reporter, it wasn't just another hurricane. It wasn't just a headline, and then I'm going to, you know, flip from the news channel over to Food Network. Now I'm watching it because there was somebody in that storm that I cared for. And the reality is, if I can start to see so much of the injustice in the world, and in particular, I mean, we focused on racism here tonight, and I think, you know, it's a place where I've got to be honest enough and humble enough with myself to go, that injustice, what is my role of empathy and courage that we've talked about, you know, to move that forward? If it's not just another headline, but I'm willing to say, there's people I love in that storm. That's when it made the difference for me. And so thanks for your courage and your openness here with us to be able to share some of those thoughts. I know time-wise, we're kind of coming down to the end. Any last thoughts that Sharon, Steffon, you guys would want to maybe share before we wrap up?
I think I want to say something to you that I said to you a couple of days ago, is that I think that, you know, you as a leader in Calvary in general, it's very, I use the term on brand to be caring and empathetic. You know, Calvary is a missions church. Calvary is a church that loves the 419. And when you're loving the 419, you're not just going into white neighborhoods, you're going into Black neighborhoods, right? So and you're going into countries that are full of brown people, and that same empathy, that same care, that same research, that same idea, we need to get in here and help people at their level, you know,
or
like where they are, regardless of how they got to that situation or what it's like. That can continue to permeate, you know, you know, the fabric of Calvary and you know, the fabric of the church, you know, on why, you know, in a wider way, you know. So,
and I think the last thing I would say is that the church can really, I think, take this opportunity to lead the way in mourning or weeping with those who weep. In that, you know, these types of situations can be very difficult. I've talked to so many people this week who, you know, we didn't know Mr. Floyd personally. But like I said, this resonates with us because, you know, we've, you know, been pulled over or had, you know, fathers, brothers, uncles, cousins, close friends pulled over who were afraid for their lives in certain situations. And so, you know, this hits home in a way that can be difficult sometimes. And I think the church has a real opportunity here to say that, you know, we are not going to stand for this in a way that actually is meaningful and that is almost tangible in a way, so that it's clear that, you know, we're not going to tolerate this kind of ideology and or behavior. And I think that that's something that can occur.
It doesn't compromise our witness. I believe that it strengthens it, you know, and it's
a good word. That's a good word. Guys, thanks for taking the time to do this, and thanks for being my friends. And
thank you.
your influence and friendship in my life, and so thankful that God not only sent you to Calvary once, He brought you back. And we are really thankful for that. And can I wrap us up? And I would just ask for those of you that are watching this, and for some of you, you're nodding your heads, you're agreeing all along. For others of you, you're going, man, there's thoughts here that I need to give some introspection and contemplation to. And maybe for some others of you, you've just even kind of just went, I don't know about this. I love, you know, one of you just said something about searching your heart. And I think that would be where I would encourage you. First step from this video to say, God, what are you speaking to my heart about? And whether it's as simple as a friendship or it's as bold as taking some kind of courageous stand of communication, or I love sharing what you said about putting our hearts in a place where we not only rejoice with those who rejoice, but we weep with those who weep, and allowing ourselves to be in that place to say, God, how would you have me and my life to be affected by what I've just heard? And so, Father, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for the privilege that we know that you love each and every one of us, God, that every soul in life matters. And so, Lord, thanks for these moments that we've been able to talk about a subject that for some can be uncomfortable at times, but is so critically important to each one of us and to the world in which we live. God, would you help us to do more than just acknowledge it with a post and a hashtag? God, would you let it be more than just another headline that we're aware of? But God, would you change our hearts so that we love every person with a love that is marked by the love and the presence of Jesus Christ, and a willingness to do what we can do to see justice and grace and salvation and forgiveness come to every person. And God, we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Hey, thanks for watching. Have a great night.
Thank you.
You.